Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's artist talk by Mario Garcia Torres. A little background, Mario Garcia Torres is from Monclova, Mexico, and received his MFA at CalArts in 2005. Recent solo exhibitions of his work have taken place at the Projects Art Center in Dublin, the Museo Nacional, Centro de Arte Reina, Sofía in Madrid, the Fundació Joan Miró in Barcelona, the Kunsthalle Zürich, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. He also participated in international exhibitions, including the Berlin Biennale, Documenta 13, and the Venice Biennale. Garcia Torres' exhibition at the Hammer Museum is the first solo exhibition of his work here in Los Angeles. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mario Garcia Torres and Hammer curator Aram Moshe.
Good afternoon. How did I do it in TV shows? They say hi again, no?
Hi again.
Hey. Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for
coming.
Thanks for having me.
Well, so we're going to talk, the kind of format of this is something much more like an artist talk, and I'm here in more of a kind of support capacity. I think the idea is to kind of cover a series of works that are maybe related and kind of bring us into the present with this most recent work for the Hammer. But Mario will kind of discuss them. And what was my role? I think I'm here to make sure that Mario doesn't forget, or he remembers to remember. So, where do we begin, Mario?
As Aram said, I kind of prepared a more or less diagonal view of my work. I'm really happy to show this piece, which is a piece that I made like 7 years ago, and not only happy to finally be able to sort of present it again. It was always very difficult to present it because it was first made as a monologue, as a stage monologue, and it requires a very big commitment from both an institution and an actor. So for a long time I was really kind of very fixated on keeping that piece as a monologue, as a theater, actual live event, and so anyway, because of this context, I proposed to show that again, and we went through that effort of finally doing it again, and I kind of gave up my fixation of keeping it alive, and we made a new performance, a kind of private performance, and documented. So finally, I'm happy to show that piece again in a different reiteration, and we can discuss afterward. But more than that, I'm also happy because it's a piece that I think it kind of brings up a number of interests that are different from most of the work that is known from me. If you go online or something and type in my name, they will like kind of the same kind of line appears again and again, and sometimes I feel like I'm a little uncomfortable about it.
We should say what that line is.
Well, it says that I do work of history and conceptual art. I don't know, like some kind of, something that is true, but at the same time, I feel like it narrows a lot of things. And this piece, I hope that it opens up a whole other number of discussions and things that are both invested in this piece and invested in the others, but somehow it kind of hopefully manages to break that thing and sort of open things up. So what I've prepared is not so many works, but I don't know, 4 or 5 works really, and it's a somewhat diagonal view of my work. I didn't want to make this like a kind of art school presentation where I say like what I did and when and how, but more like trying to keep it fun for myself and trying to make this kind of diagonal view and all leading to how the piece that is being presented here in the museum came about, and sort of trying to kind of almost explain myself. Like it's not something that is very clear for me, but more like sort of thinking about it. I kind of try to go back to that history and figure out how I came to do this piece.
And less so as a kind of chronology or narrative or something, right? Because I think a lot of what you've said that in the past is about kind of that works also kind of resist their place in chronology and time.
Yeah.
And so then even structuring this narrative can somehow kind of be antithetical to that way of
I mean, I guess at some point we can discuss that. It's one of the issues. It's a very, very important issue in the video. It's, I mean, I don't know what moment do we describe this video or not, but
we'll
yeah,
get there.
I've been lately fighting for not have a kind of historical, like linear read of my work, or at least people can make different connections instead of chronological connections. But I don't know. So I don't know. Maybe I should. So at some point, when sort of looking at what could be this sort of genealogy in my own work, I kind of came about and proposed to Aram that we should actually start talking about the first works that I made in Los Angeles, because I think the city was very influential. It was, of course, very influential, not just because I came to school here, but also because, I mean, it was influential because what I saw here, but also by what I actually imagined this city was. So it's a kind of negotiation where these contexts are kind of embedded in one into each other, one in the other. And I was living in Mexico City before coming here, and I now live back in Mexico City. And so I think the presentation that we're going to see it's a little bit that kind of most of it what happened before and after Los Angeles, or through Los Angeles really, but in relation to many other things. To try to keep it a little bit more orderly, I would like to say just that well, I'm an artist, and I was born in the north of Mexico, and lately in these kind of situations, I kind of try to force myself to kind of figure out, how come I am, or how come my work ended up being this way, and the only conclusion I know or I have is that I was the first sort of school I went through was a pretty bad school in Monterrey in Mexico, in the north, and it was really strange that the context, I think, really influenced me a lot as well, because it was a place where most of the artists that were public and people who were active and people who were teaching in school as well, and that were sort of visible in the city, where most of them they were interested in abstract expressionism, in a kind of very late version of abstract expressionism. And so when I came to school, I had this, I think, a kind of a very clear and immediate reaction as against that. And it had to do with thinking about how I kind of stupidly, I was thinking that I wanted to create some kind of work that was more sort of intellectually based and less sort of invested in a kind of gesture and like, how do you say that? Like very kind of, emotional gesture. So at the beginning, and I think that sort of stupid obsession kind of led me to looking at people who were doing what they eventually called conceptual art, and little by little I started understood that there was these people who were invested in something that I thought it was that sort of very kind of intellectual practices. And not only that, but I understood that that also, I mean, it was a very kind of specific moment in Mexico, but it was a moment where I kind of started bohemian idea that I had before. So in that negotiation, I started looking to conceptual art. And in that sense, I think I ended up getting most of the responses or the justifications for what I was doing in those little information I had. So throughout a number of years, I've been really invested in mostly researching historical chapters in conceptual art, but on the other side, I feel like it's a lot of them come from a very specific personal interest that eventually, when they become a work, they really kind of jump into asking a whole different issues that are not necessarily just the art history, or they don't not only ask questions about how art history is built, but it kind of opens up to a whole different number of issues. So that's kind of my default introduction. Yeah.
And so then, I know with this piece, some places I had seen before moving to LA. Obviously, there's this kind of idea or of a sense of place that you hadn't yet experienced, and I think what the piece kind of does is address the city's mediation that you had kind of experienced through specific lineages of like Hollywood film, but also, as you said, through kind of conceptual art, as the city being kind of having these centers or these kind of specifically charged locations. And could you maybe talk about that experience of the place from afar, and then how you came to acquire it kind of once you got here in 2003, was it?
Yeah, I came to LA in 2003, I think. Yeah. So yeah, the first piece we don't show it, but we show this still that is up there, and it's a piece that I did very very soon when I came here to LA, and it's a piece that is called, it's a 16 millimeter. Well, actually, it's a Super 8 film. Yeah, and it's a piece that it's I don't know, like a 10-minute film or something like that, and it's just a collection of locations through Los Angeles, and it's the title is Some Places I Had Seen Before Moving to LA, and the reason why we thought we should talk about it is because, first because it talks about that. It's a very simple thing that I did, and it had to do with sort of coming to Los Angeles and figuring out that it was not necessarily what I imagined, but at the same time thinking that what I imagined actually existed in the city. So I sort of got to the work of looking for specific locations, some who are related to specific films that I remembered, and others that are related to, places where conceptual artworks happened. So it's a kind of it's a silent film where you see one location after the other, and they are mixed. So you see on one side the house of the character in Karate Kid, and then next to that you see the place where Robert Barry released Xenon, and the place where Hubler marked a point to make a kind of drawing around the world and things like that, and so it was important because of that. I feel like it's a very simple piece, and then eventually I saw a film by Tom Anderson, and I realized, oh, that's way more interesting than what I could do. So I feel very ambiguous about the piece, and it's something that I have a certain it's kind of dear to me, but in a way it's such a simple piece. But on the other side, we decided that we wanted to show it because can we stop this now, because it's not yet that. But it was interesting because it was the first moment that I kind of started thinking about art history was interested in terms of relating that into a kind of cinematic space. And at the time I was interested in sort of figuring out how I was going to relate to art history, and not only to art history, but in relation to art historians. And so I was trying to figure out what was my position in that. And in that sense, I started thinking, like, of course, if I am going to do something about art history, I have to do it in a very personal way, and not only that, but I need to do it in a kind of in a space that would allow that to not be something that I pretend to make as written in stone or like permanent. So in that sense, a kind of cinematic space opened, and I thought that was a kind of interesting space to think about it and to think about history and to put history in a space where things could be fiction, or that you can experience things where they're not really set in stone. So in that sense, that piece was important, and in that sense, it kind of it's to me it's very clear the relation from these two. I'm not a flopper.
Mm. So should we talk about the Kim Jong-il favorite movies as a kind of extension of that as well?
So this the first piece we can actually see, it's a piece that it's called 1 minute to act a title, Kim Jong-il's favorite movies, and it's something I also made it quite early in LA, and I was going through school, and it seemed very interesting to me to sort of figure out, make a film in relation to being here and sort of trying to be feel like I was part of the city in a way, and so that was kind of the first film I really felt like it was made in the tradition of a proper Hollywood film, although it was very, very simple. But so I kind of figured out what was the most economic way to make a film, and at the same time, it was a piece that I was looking into. I was going to school, and I was thinking like, well, I must find some other different views of what a film is, of what art is, which were questions that were coming from that sort of early story I was telling you about, and that sort of led to thinking that there was some kind of mysterious character in Korea that had actually written a couple of books, and one of them was about a kind of big manifesto about cinema, and I sort of started reading that stuff. I figured out that actually some film schools actually use it, and of course it's a very his view of cinema is something that he pretends to use as or pretended to use as a propaganda, but then reading through that, I figured out that actually he was interested in writing that kind of manifesto, but at the same time he was actually looking at a lot of Hollywood films. So this piece was kind of my first take on figuring out how to negotiate those ideas and negotiate also sort of bringing this sort of slightly political positions or political views, and how to see them through Hollywood and see them through a very kind of conceptually oriented structure, or conceptually oriented way of constructing works. So we could.
So let's.
I guess we can just see it.
Dim the lights.
It's like
and then
5 minutes or something like that. It's silent. So that was a very it's a film that I I shot once, and it was a kind of just in terms of how it was constructed was very important for me, that I wanted to make it in proper film. I wanted to work with actors, which not all of them are, but some of them are professional actors, but also I was interested in kind of shooting something once and making it kind of an event. So it was important for me. That was kind of, on one side, was really kind of flirting with the structures of Hollywood, but on the other side, its real genealogy came from sort of artists documenting their work and how to think about an act, and what was the gesture that we were going to document.
Right, and also that the length of the film would be kind of determined by the ability of the performers in a way, that it could almost have a kind of variable running time based on the kind of aptitude of the performers and the people guessing the charade, so that there's a kind of inherent structure to it.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it was shot once, and it was a game that happened. I mean, it was a film that we made in 20 minutes or less, and it's what it is. And yeah, I mean, it was kind of important for me to kind of translate information and translate. I mean, I kind of think that most of my works, in one way or the other, they're just text, and text that somehow they find a different way to be delivered. And this time I thought that this was a kind of interesting structure. But yeah, I mean, at the end, it's a film that is just a list of films.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe rather than kind of try to find a connection per se to the next film, I mean, there is something in the next project that we're going to discuss, which is the Transparencies of the Non-Act, which is from a couple of years later, that in a way, it's kind of departing from this idea of having some relationship to kind of cinematic narrative per se, but it's dealing, this piece specifically, with an artist figure, and kind of, again, thinking about how there are a number of your works, especially over the kind of last 10 years, that are dealing specifically with kind of artist genealogies and stories that are specific to certain kind of like artist identities. But in this case, Oscar Neustern is an artist who kind of remains absent and is kind of he himself is a kind of void figure. Mm-hmm. So that your ability to even reconstruct anything or a story from his narrative is quite limited. So maybe, would you care to talk about that?
Yeah. I think that sort of, with this piece, I think a lot of something that I guess is somewhat present in a lot of works are this sort of kind of the insistence of looking for what is not being told and what is left in these voids. And in this specific case, the story that sort of brought me to do this was that I was really I was looking at a lot of information and stuff, and I at some point I found that there was a character there was a review of an artist's work in a magazine, and I was really kind of intrigued by what was described in the review, and nevertheless I couldn't figure out who that was, and this was Oscar Neustern. It was a review that was published in Art News in 1969, and after sort of reading the text several times and trying to imagine what was happening, then I realized that actually that review was a sort of ironic text, and it had been inserted in the magazine, and it had been published like any other review, but somehow it kind of led to a non-existent artist, and there was a number of things that attracted me, not only because I didn't find the character, but also because at the time, 30 years later, I thought it was really still a very interesting text. It was at the beginning written with a certain irony to it, and it was a little bit of a joke about conceptual artists. But suddenly, all the things that sort of surrounded these artists were things that I was seeing in other things happening at the time. So Oscar Neustern, there was a number of things that sort of yeah.
What was the main biographical kind of fact that was included in the review
So-
about Oscar Neustern?
So Oscar Neustern, Neustern is it's in German. It will be the new star, and it described an artist that had how do you call this, like amnesia. So it was an artist who could never finish a work because he could only remember the day before or something like that. So, and in that sense, it kind of put him according to the text, it put him in this kind of very kind of idealistic. I mean, it kind of only his ideas were works, and that was one of the qualities of him. And the other was that he didn't allow his work to be photographed. So most of the things that were happening to him were works, but only they could be described. And so he was writing things, but then so the only way that they made those thoughts public was through press releases. And so there was a number of things that were really interesting and intriguing to me. So I ended up making a slight piece, which I just scanned the other day because I tried to kind of. It's a piece that is very important to think that the text that is being delivered is actually slides and it's actually physically film where light is going through film. So I kind of made my best effort to try to represent it here. So we'll just see it.
This is the digital HD version.
Yeah.
Okay. So shall we dim the lights, please?
Should I do it?
It does.
I doesn't think so.
So there's something about kind of taking what was somewhat of like a disingenuous gesture on the part of Kiki Kundry or whoever was the author of it, but then kind of inserting, I don't know, some degree of sentimentality or kind of sincerity to this thing, right? And elaborating a little bit further on this idea of this figure who may or may not have existed, but most likely didn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, when I did the piece, that was a kind of my main concern was to how to figure out. I mean, I thought it was. I mean, the piece became sort of this kind of very poetic text, but in a way, I think it hopefully kind of reaches a number of points that I thought were interesting in that sort of ironic text, but the most. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to show it today is because of that. It was potentially the first piece that I used clearly fictional information to turn it into something interesting. I mean, something, or that pretended to be real, and how to sort of how that space between fiction and reality could potentially lead us to interesting questions.
Mm. And it has to do so much with, I mean, thinking about this kind of period of time specifically of interest, like being kind of late 1960s and the rise of conceptual art and the idea of kind of dematerialization of art, but also kind of thinking about the dematerialization of like an artistic identity or the idea of like artistic authority or persona or something like that.
Well, I thought, one of the most important things for me in the text was like, in sort of ironic terms, they were trying to say like, what's going on with these crazy guys? Why are they trying to dematerialize and I don't know how to say it, but and to take out that sort of aura from a persona, from an artist and all that stuff, and read 30 years later, I thought this was the most interesting thing to like. I mean, it seemed like if this artist was real, he was taking things way much farther away. Like not only his work were only ideas, but actually were things that he was forgetting immediately, and all this sort of looking for something was already the work, and not necessarily even making a statement and things like that. So, in that sense, I thought it was quite. Important to discuss it.
And for you, I mean, kind of taking specifically something that potentially runs the risk of being, I mean, absent or, I mean, in the kind of apotheosis of the conceptual in art is the kind of, idea and concept over any other kind of response that one could have. But then this work kind of indicates something more towards like this poetic or lyrical kind of response to that, so that to kind of also run in a way counter to the dominant narrative of that history, would you say?
I mean it's kind of it comes from a sort of certain insistence of trying to relativize our history and try to, I mean, which also could lead to I'm not a flopper, but it's sort of the idea of thinking that our history. It's something that it's changing, which is not such a big news, but also it's something that at least is each of us can have a very personal history, and something that is not something that anybody can teach, but something that it's sort of related every day, and it changes every day, and it changes from place to place, and in that sense, it's sort of trying to go away from making like straightforward text and making big statements and sort of put those histories in that cinematic and in that poetic space.
Should we
I don't know how we're doing with time, but
let's go to Reina.
This other piece I wanted to also show it here, which is this is an installation in a museum in Chicago, but the work I wanted to talk about is the one that it's on the right, which is a vitrine with the number of faxes. And the reason why I thought it was important to show this piece was because it's the very beginning of a very long project for which I made a number of works, and the first one was this one, which is a number of faxes, and there, it's a piece that I consider, or the subtitle of it is a film treatment, and it's a film treatment. It's a narrative where the story of a character or the person who is signing these letters, which is actually me, is going to Afghanistan to try to it's dated in late 2011.
2001.
2001, I don't know anymore. But it tells a story of somebody going to Afghanistan to look for a hotel that Alighiero Boetti had there, the Italian artist had there in the 1970s. And it was important to talk about that because it's a piece that I started to make here, and it's very specific, specifically related to the tropes of cinema. It's something that I did first without really thinking that it was going to be a long project, and it's interesting because on one side it's something that came out of sort of certain anxiety of living in the United States, living in Hollywood, and sort of mixing the anxiety of living here and knowing that there was a war happening, and at the same time sort of trying to figure out what could be an excuse to say something about it without being pamphletarian about it. So it's a kind of the treatment for a film where there's a number of poetic relationships through those things. The excuse to make the piece is somebody making the gesture of finding this building where Boetti had a hotel, which is nothing to do with politics, but on the other side, it sort of acknowledged the context where it's happening, and so it's a piece that tells in a kind of poetic way. It sort of talks about the disappearance of the hotel of Boetti, and at the same time the disappearance of
Kabul,
of Osama bin Laden, and it sort of ends with a statement by somebody in the U.S. government saying, like, actually, the goal has never been to get Osama bin Laden, and so it was just a number of information that I was sort of reading here and there and sort of mixing with a real honest gesture, which was to think about how to look for this hotel and like how to grab that story that I was interested in, and which was very intriguing for me to think that some artists had gone to this faraway place and set up a whole new life there.
And I mean, in some ways, I know that, I mean, the culmination of this project came to be in Documenta. But would you say that the film that you made, T, I mean, it's not necessarily this isn't the treatment for that film per se, even though that T does become a kind of narrative of your own kind of ability to go to Afghanistan for the first time in 2010 or 12?
Yeah,
No.
so the story is that I wrote this text and presented it, and throughout the time I was, I wrote the thing, but I was still obsessed of looking for that, and sort of, and this was parallel to the war happening there, and at the same time, at some point I figured out that precisely because of war, suddenly there was a number of images coming out of Afghanistan, and so through those images I started to think, well, I would not dare to go to Afghanistan and do this sort of stupid artist research, which didn't seem appropriate or ethically correct to do. But I could potentially look for this one hotel or for this story through somebody else's or through that context output, which was these images. So I made a second piece, which is a slideshow, and it's really a kind of, at the end of it is really an essay about photography and about photojournalism, and that's a still for the last film. But this is a still from the slideshow, and I started to really kind of reconstruct the neighborhood where Boetti's hotel was through war images. I mean, you could when you really start looking at images made in Afghanistan, you understand that there's waves of production. There's like moments where the Islamic law, it's more prevalent, so there's less images. When there was the Russian occupation, there was very little images, and you can tell when journalists came in specific moments. So at the end of the 1980s, when the Russians left, there was a chunk of image production, and consequently, there's politics always sort of define when images are made. So I made this when I sort of reconstructed the neighborhood, and I figured out a number of things. First, that the building was not where it was, and there was a number of mistakes in what I was written about Poeti. And at some point, I found the hotel through somebody else who was actually doing the same thing as me, but he was actually walking in the streets of Afghanistan. So one interesting thing is that I made the piece, and it's as I said, it's a kind of photography essay at the end, but with the excuse of Poeti. And at some point, the curator from Documenta invited me to go to Afghanistan. So I had to ask myself that question of if I should go to a place in war, and it was less of a moral question, I think, and it was more about sort of trusting does art is really important, or can we really do something about it, right, or with it, or.
And how do you reconcile that kind of role, I guess?
Well, I just did it out of an impulse. I couldn't say no, and so in a way, it was something. For me, it was something very important to sort of go against my will in that sense, because it was interesting to sort of change. One of the things. It's already a number of years, but one of the things that I was saying at the beginning, which was to kind of to try to pretend to make some kind of a very intellectual sort of approach to art. Throughout the years, little by little, I started realizing how stupid that idea was. So in a way, the last film I made about this project, it really kind of acknowledged, and it's part of the narrative where it says that, it's sometimes one needs to sort of start projects without really knowing what the final result will be. And so in that sense, it was important to also talk about it here in relation to I'm Not a Flopper, because this last film actually became a sort of reality of what I had written.
The film T, you mean?
In a different way, it kind of became the film. It's far away from exactly what it's written in the film treatment, but in a way, when I was filming there, it felt like I was actually realizing the film that I had written 5 years before or something like that. So in that sense was.
And was there any kind of discomfort, I guess, casting yourself in this central position? Because there is some sense of like identifying with these figures who chose to kind of recede or withdraw, from a kind of idea of artist like being present, and then therefore in like T it comes full circle, and then it's kind of becomes very much a film focused on you in some ways. Yeah,
it's also interesting that you say that, because in relation, for example, to the 1 minute to 1 minute whatever that film that we just saw. At the moment, I was really looking into. I was asking myself, what is the simplest way that I can make a film, and how do I negotiate that with Hollywood and with the sort of history of that production. And in a way, I was flirting with that, but then on the other side, it was very clear to me that this had to be a gesture, and in that sense, I was really interested in sort of acknowledging that. In that sense, now, like 10 years after, T was a film, and it used a number of structures from film production, but at the end, it was just that. It was just the documentation of an artist's gesture. And so the gesture that, to sort of make apprentice and try to describe what we're talking about, is T it's a 1 hour film where the main gesture that is documented there is it's my relation to the house that Alligator Boetti had used in the 1970s as a hotel. And when I went there for the first time, I experienced for the first time being in the place, and after some years we could manage to rent the house for a year. And so when we took over the house, I realized that the house was kind of falling apart structurally. So we throughout that year we repaired the house. We made some structural repairs, and we remade the garden, and we lived there and had people over and talked about why I was doing that. And so that is what is documented in the film in a kind of very cinematic way, but at the end is a documentation of a performance.
Right.
So at some point I decided that it needed somebody to kind of move forward the film, and it ended up being me.
I mean, that's a perfect segue into the smithy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just about kind of here's another slide, but kind of thinking about again the kind of the documentation of a gesture, the documentation of a performance, and specifically, I mean, it kind of leads into talking about Alan Smithy and the film Upstairs. It has its own kind of origin story with it that begins, in some ways, kind of with this piece by Ryan Gander.
Yeah, so, well, I don't know how many of you have seen it, and it's kind of complicated to know how much we describe it, but just to give a little bit of an introduction, the piece Upstairs it's a monologue that as I said, I made a number of years ago. I co-wrote a number of years ago with Aaron Schuster, and it takes that sort of fictional story, if we can say that, of the character Alan Smithy, which is a pseudonym that filmmakers use in Hollywood when they want to withdraw their name from a film, from a project. So from the 1960, I think 67 was the first time they used it. It was the Directors Guild of America who worried about making sure that the position of a director, film director, was clear and was present in film consumption.
And as a way of kind of retaining authorial control.
And it sort of making sure that the director was the author of films. And so they were really invested in making sure that all films had a director. So when people wanted to withdraw, they invented this pseudonym, Alan Smithy. And so they did it once, and then they did it again and again. And after 30 years, I realized that Alan Smith, many people have written about it, but when I saw this, I thought it was really interesting to know that there was a body of work that was out there, and that we could see it as one body of work, and that the fact that it was a body of work that was made by many people, that was shaped mainly by shame, and that was made in a kind of strange chronological, non-chronological, it built in a non-chronological way. I thought it was really interesting to sort of bring that into the art world and think about invention and creation. How do we read somebody's work these days? So all, this and many other issues are sort of discussed when I sort of had this character try to become Alan Smithy and try to defend his work and try to explain that even though he didn't exist, it was still an interesting body of work in itself. And even if there's pretty bad films, there is a certain coherence among them and how we can read that. So this was something the story is that this is something I made in London first in 2007, and the very it was I should say that it was interesting to do it here again, because after this number of years I was interested in Smithy becoming had to have a different name and to have not a different name but a different face. And in a way, it's a text and maybe some directorial instructions that somehow I like to having very different visual forms. So so at some point, when I started writing this, or when I started thinking about the project, I thought that I didn't want to write this thing, but I wanted a ghostwriter to write it. It seemed coherent at the time. So so that's the reason why we have this image there, which is it's a work by Ryan Gander. And the reason why it's there is because at some point I called Ryan at the time and I asked him. I knew he had worked with a ghostwriter, so I asked him if he could give me the information of this guy. And I ended up having a meeting with the ghostwriter, and I told him the story, and I told him what I wanted the script to be. And he said, well, yeah, I mean, let's work and let's see if it works between you and me. So then after the first delivery, I realized that I didn't like what he had written, or we didn't really understood each other. So at some point, the ghostwriter went back to Ryan Gander and said, look, you know what, this guy made me work for nothing. And so Ryan Gander ended up buying this text from him and made a whole other version of it. So and what he did with it is that he bought the text and silkscreen it in a museum wall. This is the second version of the work, and then plaster over it. So now my work, or the work that is actually upstairs, not only exists as a performance in London in 2007 as a film here, but also some kind of version exists in different museums where Ryan has actually buried a text about Alan Smithy, at least, at the beginning of it.
And so then when you eventually did, kind of end up writing it yourself with Aaron Schuster, the idea for Freeze was to kind of treat it as a kind of more of a performance that, it was documented, but it wasn't really kind of documented as a work per se. But I think we have...
Yeah, it was at the time. It was very, very important to insert it. It was a piece that was made for a prize that I won, and it was very important for me to insert this monologue among the activities of the fair. So it was actually it was presented as a conference by Alan Smithy, and it was kind of strange that most people, when we did it, people thought I was going to talk, and then when people came in, they just saw somebody who was standing on a desk and reading his papers, and suddenly he started talking and becoming Alan Smithy. And as you will see or have seen, it's a piece that it's very kind of very clearly acknowledged what is happening. It's very kind of very self-conscious piece, and so it was it was thought about. It was thought for as a stage piece, and we worked on it for a long time, and then we presented it once. So I was, it was for me, it was a really nice experience to suddenly work in that sense and kind of suddenly have a piece be activated by somebody else and sort of have to cope with whatever happened on stage. Mm-hmm. And so I was, and that's part of the reason why I was really, for a long time, very fixated about keeping it as a stage performance. And of course, when you proposed to make something, I couldn't think of even doing something new, but like bringing this to Los Angeles, and not only that, but sort of thinking about sort of TV aesthetics also. And so one of the arguments in the monologue is that Alan Smithy claims that most people don't know him and don't recognize him as a director, but at the end most people have seen his films and TV or late shows, and so it's actually TV which, as he puts it, makes him more successful or more visible. So in a way, I wanted to bring this back into that context, and so that's the reason why I we started thinking about bringing him into a TV station and have a number of TV shows, structures to actually deliver the text again.
Right, as a kind of further mediation, I guess, of his persona. And I mean, it's important also to kind of mention with the piece that it's filmed live, so that the actor David Dasmalchian, who is kind of performing it as if it's a kind of live performance, so that there's all the editing happens kind of in real time.
Yeah, so again, it's it's a text. It's the pieces, again, it's just a text that, I mean, somehow I work with David again to kind of make sure that the character was the same character, but again, it's his delivery, again, as the first 1 minute to title. Is the text that defines how long the piece is the text that defines, or it's the structure of the film that actually has a number of cameras, and it's the TV station editor who cuts it, and it's again how to, I mean, this time I feel like it's more like a TV show than a film, but it's a kind of a structure to make something happen instead of constructing it.
Right. So should we watch maybe, I mean, just as a kind of refresher, and then we'll turn it over, but maybe just 5 or so minutes of the start
Sure.
of the film?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's switch it over.
I'm not a flopper. I'm not a flopper. I said it. I am not a flop. I'm not, even if that's what they want me to be. And this is precisely what I came here today to talk about. I know about flops, and I had my fair share of them. I'm even kind of an expert. I mean, look, I admit it, I traffic in lousy films. Shim Sham Shimmy, The Shrimp on the Barbie, Blood-Sucking Pharaohs in Pittsburgh. Time fillers. But you know what? I am not a failure. If success, as Joe Scanlon puts it, is based more on circulation than recognition, then I've certainly made it. You all know me. You've all seen my movies most likely on television, even if you've never noticed my name at the end of the credits. Honestly, I think that there's not enough time given to credits, so there's too many people in the credits that are credited, which kind of discredits the whole thing. But my name's not important. It is Alan Smithy. It's my name, but it's a made-up name, too. If you're a bit clever, you can rearrange the letters to spell out the alias men. What's it like to be an alias? I'm going to tell you. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to thank Aaron Moschietti and everyone at the Hammer Museum here for making my appearance possible today. I'd like to thank as well Ted, my manager, Pedro, my agent, for thinking about me, or thank you. You know, when Mario Garcia Torres initially talked to me, I must admit I was a little bit skeptical about the whole idea. I mean, first of all, I'm not even sure how many of my films that Mario has seen, but you know, didn't really even ask me to speak about my films, even though that's usually when they're interested, what people want to know. In fact, Mario's instructions were pretty vague, but now that I think about it, that was kind of a ploy to try and set a situation and see what happened. Now, while we discussed this presentation, I must say that he had a few points and he managed to convince me of a couple of them, but most of the time we didn't agree. So this is going to be my personal take on it. Let's make it clear. I am not a front man for Mr. Garcia Torres. Okay. I should start by introducing myself. As I mentioned before, I'm a filmmaker. I make films. I'm known as Alan Smithy, or Alan with an L-A-N, or sometimes Adam, but the name's not important. I mean, it's only important insofar as it gathers together a certain group of works. Sometimes I think that I'm Might not actually be a guy. Maybe I'm a woman or a collectivity. I could have been Walter Plinch, Georgina Spelvin, or David Agnew, or Paul Prokopoulos. You know, Paul Prokopoulos, the pianist. It's an amazing story, but I don't think I should get sidetracked so early here. I'll keep that for later. Smithy is a pseudonym. You know that. Sometimes I like to say it, though, to be perfectly clear. I am the name that film directors use when they want to withdraw themselves from the films that they've made, for whatever reason. Shame comes up a lot. If you're a film director and you disagree with the studio that hired you, if you don't like, say, the way that they cut the film, for example, or maybe you don't want to be connected to it anymore, then you can appeal to the Directors Guild of America. And they review the case, and then if it's approved, they'll take your name out and they put mine in its place. Alan Smithy. Alan Smithy has 78 films to his credit today. It's complex and it's remarkable for various reasons. But today, more than looking at each one of my films, I'm more interested in thinking of the whole phenomenon, the production as a whole, as a creative act. A spontaneous, surefire creative act. Is it possible that an awareness of dishonor can become a creative act? Is it possible that an awareness of dishonor can become a creative act? I think that it can. I'm the product of it, not my films, me. Their shame produces Smithy. I'm an idea, just an idea. I am the data face of the corporation. Their most avant-garde creation to date. It's a strange, but it's a revealing fact. Sometimes the movie industry is more avant-garde than the avant-garde. I'm an idea that was invented by this small group of property intellectuals, or should I simply say the lawyers, and then developed by an ever larger and more heterogeneous group of artists and pranksters. It has to do with the position of the auteur on cinema. In my case, I have my own arguments about this, but I'll get into those in a moment. I have been around since 1969. Yes, I need to define myself before I get carried away. I am a text. I am a script. I am not a person. And I guess I am simply a story written by a mistaken outcome of life.
We should turn it over to the audience in case there are any questions.
In the film that we were just playing up there, you made a reference, a connection between Orson Welles and Smitty. And I was just wondering if you could maybe expand a bit more on how you made that connection. Did Orson Welles have any kind of detachment from the work that he was done and the ghostwriting that he didn't write about? Were those true facts?
There's two things that connect Smithy with Orson Welles. One is that one of the hypotheses that where the name of Smithy comes from, there was a mention of a name Smithy in Confidential Report, which is a film from '55 by Orson Welles, and there is a character there called Mr. Arcading, and Mr. Arcading also has amnesia in relation to Neustern. He wasn't the same as Neustern. And somebody comes and tell him, maybe you're not Mr. Arcading, maybe you are something else, and maybe you are Smithy. So that is sort of one hypothesis, that maybe the name was taken from there, or that's one of the. And and the other is what's his name? The Transformers film where Orson Welles gives the voice to one of the characters. The Transformers 2, I think, it's credited to Alan Smithy. And it was a bad film, and I think Michael Bay.
Yeah.
Michael Bay, yeah. Took out his name, and it was credited to Smithy. So those are the two connections. Yeah.
I just wanted to first say that I thought it was funny that you mentioned LA Plays Itself, or you just mentioned Tom Anderson earlier, because it's playing right now at the Cine Family. started
really?
when
He's
this talk
haunting
I would
you.
like to
Tom
see it
Anderson
again
is haunting you.
for fourth time.
But my question was, I was wondering what you thought about you turning Alan Smithy into an actor, because I think in the text that the Hammer printed, it speaks about the IMDb of Alan Smithy and that there's a filmography that's in existence the filmography is credited to directors, but now he exists as an actor from your film. And I was wondering what you thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was, when I tried to think about how to rescue that body of work, I thought that the best way was somebody to argue for it. So if you see the piece, you will see that the character, the actor momentarily becomes Alan Smithy, but then at the same time he's sort of all the time acknowledging that he is not, that he is an actor and that he's just playing that for moments. So he kind of struggles. I mean, in the script there is that sort of game between being able, an actor being able to play or not. So it's a representation. It's a kind of illustration on one side, but at the same time, it sort of acknowledges that it's impossible. It's just a pseudonym, and he's just an idea. And that's also part of the reason why I was interested in now having at least a second face, because I'm interested in that sort of that character becoming many faces, and maybe the next one could be a woman or more people, or several people at the same time, which was also one thing that I was sort of discussing at the beginning. But at some point I thought that the most successful way to defend that work was to have somebody talk in front of you, in front of people.
It may or may not come out as a question. First of all, I have to say I'm really glad to be learning more about your work, and to hear you insist on the notion of fiction, which kind of started throwing light on one of the things one of the aspects of the work that I thought about. Maybe this will come as a series of questions. I wanted to know first of all, was the actor, when you did the same piece for the stage, was the actor a British actor or an American actor, English-speaking actor?
He is a British actor, but he played with an American accent.
I mean, this has to do with the agency of the actor, of the performer, with regards to the English language used in the piece. I can see that you adopt different voices somehow in your different works. In this case, naturally, the voice is coming out of someone else, and someone who's a trained actor and who has, of course, command over the English language better than you and I. I'm not a native speaker myself. When I look at some of your works, however, I see the written works, the ones that my impression is that are most that are closest to you penning them. I can see sometimes there's funny idiomatic mistakes or punctuation mistakes. It doesn't necessarily bother me, because now you understand more this notion of the fiction somehow, and my interest suddenly turns into agency and your voice. Where's your voice? Is it coming out of you, or is it coming out of your character? Then I see this actor who is actually performing really flawlessly in his English, and I wonder about the agency of this actor. I mean, how much did he take part in, let's say, rewriting this piece? And then, of course, I think I didn't see the one in England, but how much would that person would have transformed, let's say, the precise wording of the piece, and what that eventually does to the voice in the work, to your voice, to their voice. I mean, where does that lie?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, when I worked with the actor in England, it was the first time that I really worked with somebody in such a direct way, that I needed to build this character. and the character, we had written something. I kind of felt like when in the process of writing, I had a number of. It was like writing an essay. It was like, what are the issues? First, it was structural. Like, what are the issues that I want to discuss? How do we do that? And then Aaron Schuster was very good at putting the good lines, really. And he is a native American, so he was very good at sort of giving that shape first. But then once the text existed and I kind of had a more or less clear idea of what that text should be, of that, how that was going to be, I realized that, the first time that the actor read the script, it was such a shameful character. It was just like very sad and terrible. So so it was a very long process to kind of keep shaping the character through working with the actor. So the first actor was very invested in that sense, and he really adopted the language. I felt like he really changed a number of lines in the structure that he felt more comfortable with. So he changed some words, even though the meaning was not, it's more or less the same. He really adopted it, I think. And but then when we set up to do it here again, on the other side, it seemed like that delivery in London was a way more, maybe it came out as a more warm delivery, because he really was really passionate about it, and yeah, it was a very kind of intimate setting and development in a way. And when we did it here, I was really interested in taking another part of, it was the same text, but at the same time I was really interested in trying to figure out a different way of working, and in making more clear that what we were going to do was, again, just a different delivery of the same text. So what we did here, instead of having somebody learn the whole 80 pages or whatever they are, it's a lot of them, he worked and learned some of the lines, but most of them were delivered by a teleprompter, which is something that it's also part of the piece. So you see this character that is just, at some point he seemed very invested in it, and once in a while you see that there is this text being delivered to him. So he kind of becomes almost like Alan Smith, a little bit like an automaton, kind of delivering this thing. So he also goes back and forth between being a person and suddenly being just somebody repeating this thing, and sometimes he comes back and becomes an actor playing somebody, and sometimes he's just David Desmalchen. So there's many, that negotiation that you're asking, I think it's very, very much part of the piece.
And has this actually made you rethink a little bit your use of English language in other works? Suddenly having Aaron Schuster and the actors rework, has it thrown any light on any of your other works?
No, the only thing I could that's interesting. No, I should think about that. But yeah, the only thing I could say is that those mistakes or strange constructions, I sometimes tend to leave them there precisely because of that, because I want to. I feel like as you know, most of the time my work is not shown in Mexico or not shown in places, Latin America places. So most of the works are made in English, but then at the same time I try to have them be transparent in that sense, to sort of have them not be perfect. Like the last corrections, I try to not be careful about them. But yeah, it's interesting what you say, to think about, back in sort of.
Let's take one more question and then we'll wrap it up. I see a hand right there.
In both the Smithy piece and the slideshow piece, kind of the subject are both artist that destabilize the position of the artist. So Smithy is this kind of alias character, and then the other artist being this fictional artist, and both of them are kind of investigating formats of work which are also sort of challenging to kind of traditional formats of art. And you kind of seem to consistently go back to this sort of 65 to 75 period of conceptualism, which also is known for that same type of investigation. Your formats for the delivery of the information tend to be stable, sound or text, slideshows, videos, films, etc. I was wondering if you could talk about that relationship between the kind of communicative formats you use and the subject matter that you address.
Well, I mean, it, as I said at the beginning, yes, it's this sort of diagonal sort of presentation here. It had to do with that, with sort of thinking about thinking that hopefully the work is not necessarily in a very kind of narrow way, but it really sort of comes back to a number of issues, which it takes these sort of very fundamental questions, like what is an artist and how that works, and what is the system that allows that to happen. So in that sense, it's interesting that you say that. But then, as to how are things delivered, is I don't know. I feel like it's something that I think every time there is a work, it's not like I don't feel like there is a certain formula going in every work, but more like if it's a question that I try to ask myself every time. So there's a very different reason. I mean, in the case of I'm Not a Flopper, it was interesting to sort of suddenly bring it back to Los Angeles, bring it back to a TV format. It's something that, in a way, makes me a little bit nervous because I'm less invested in the sort of aesthetics of TV, but it's things that I feel like every I mean the perception of those things keep changing. I think it's not the same to see now. I see the film that I made in 2005, and it seems like it was made in the 1940s, and that has to do not. I made a specific decision when I made it in 2005, and I felt that when I made the decision, it seemed like it was just a 16mm film, like maybe it will connect you to photo, like to TV journalism at some point or something like that. I mean, it seemed like some older medium, but at the same time, it didn't seem that far as it seems now. So it's really difficult to think, to see works after some years. I mean, it's so fast. I feel like it's, you make something, and 3 years later, that decision is already perceived as something different. So it's really difficult to keep controlling what the perception or what the read of that work is.
I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank Mario for being here again and coming back.